Hey, Dr. Dickon Weatherby here from Optimal DX. Over the last couple of weeks, I've been posting a few little posts and articles about two biomarkers that we see on pretty much every chemistry screen, and that's potassium and sodium. And I know that it's oftentimes easy to overlook these biomarkers, but I really want to take a moment here to do a sort of a summary video of what I've covered in the last couple of weeks so that you have in one place all of the information that you need to be able to evaluate and know what sodium and potassium are on a chemistry screen, and also what some of the implications are for a high and low value. Let's get back to sodium and potassium. We're going to kick off with sodium. So sodium constitutes roughly 90% of the electrolyte fluid. It is the most prevalent cation in the extracellular fluid, and it acts as the chief base of the blood where it aids in maintaining acid-base balance. It also functions to maintain osmotic pressure. It aids in nerve impulse transmission. And of course, if you can remember back to your biochemistry, it is essential for cellular transport as part of the sodium-potassium pump. Now, potassium, on the other hand, is the main intracellular cation, and it acts as the primary intracellular pH buffer. So the most of potassium lives inside the cell. And that's when you're looking at potassium and sodium on a chem screen, you'll notice that the sodium is about 30 times higher than the potassium. That's because the potassium lives mostly inside the cell where it acts as that primary intracellular pH buffer. Now, small amounts are found in other tissues such as bone and blood. And along with the sodium, it plays an important role in the kidney's regulation of pH. So with an elevated potassium and a sodium, we have to think about dehydration. So dehydration is very common. It's a problem that can be acute and it can also be chronic. And it's definitely something that we want to avoid when our patients are getting their blood taken. So if someone's not drinking adequate fluids, and by fluids I mean pure water, no coffee, no tea, no soda, no alcohol, the night before they have a blood draw. So we want to encourage our patients to have plenty of fluid in their body before they have the blood draw, because what can happen is if they don't have enough fluid, we can get what is called hemoconcentration. And what ends up happening is certain elements within the blood are increased relative to that hemoconcentration of the blood itself. So that's why with dehydration, we see an increased red blood cell count, we see an increased hematocrit, we see an increased hemoglobin. And of course, if we pay attention to our electrolytes, we will also see an increased potassium and an increased sodium. As I'm going to talk about in a few moments, when we're looking at sodium and potassium regulation, typically the regulation of potassium and sodium and the dysregulation causes those values to actually move in different directions. So seeing both of them being increased is actually a really good sign of dehydration. So what are some of the problems with dehydration? Well, signs of mild to moderate dehydration would include thirst, dry mouth. Oftentimes people are fatigued if they've got this sort of chronic mild to moderate dehydration going on. They can have headaches. And as it gets more severe, we get rapid breathing. And that's when we have our pH system, our respiratory system kind of comes on board to try and help balance out some of the acid-base issues that are going on. They can have a rapid heartbeat, severe dizziness or lightheadedness. And God forbid, if it's absolutely a problematic, you're out in the desert and you haven't drunk for a couple of days, unconsciousness or delirium. And interestingly enough, if you see an increased potassium, obviously think about dehydration, and we'll talk about some of the adrenal implications as well, but also because that potassium is an intracellular cation, it lives inside the cell. Anytime that there is a rupture or cellular membrane disruption, the potassium can leak out of the cell and start to increase. So one of the things to think about with an increased potassium, when it's not necessarily adrenal, it's not necessarily dehydration, is to think about some kind of tissue or cellular damage. Okay, let's talk now about sodium regulation. And with sodium regulation, you want to think about the adrenals. So both sodium and potassium are under the influence of the adrenal cortex hormones, especially the mineral corticoid hormone aldosterone, which is synthesized in this particular part of the adrenal cortex called the zona glomerulosa. Now, aldosterone has a slightly stronger impact on sodium than it does on potassium, but I wanted to kind of walk through the sort of physiological actions of aldosterone on sodium and potassium because it lends itself nicely to one of the patterns that we look at for adrenal insufficiency and also adrenal stress. So basically, aldosterone, when it's at its normal or optimal level, is really about keeping sodium in the body. Sodium has a tendency to want to be released in through the kidneys into the urine, and aldosterone causes the kidneys to increase the reabsorption of sodium. I'm not going to go through renal physiology, it's incredibly complicated, but suffice it to say that with renal reabsorption of sodium is under the influence of aldosterone. On the other hand, it has a slightly different impact on potassium. It actually causes less reabsorption of potassium, and therefore we get more potassium being released through the kidneys into the urine. So let's talk about low aldosterone. So situations of low aldosterone are also found with situations of adrenal insufficiency. If you look over at the adrenal cortex here, you'll know that the zone here that releases cortisol is very much under the same influences as the influences that cause aldosterone release as well. So adrenal insufficiency obviously is a stage 2, stage 3 issue. And so adrenal insufficiency is actually very, very common, and it will have an impact on the regulation of sodium and potassium in the body. So we talked about how aldosterone really causes the kidneys to hold on to sodium. So if you have low aldosterone, the kidneys are now going to be releasing more sodium into the urine, therefore decreasing our serum sodium levels. And it's going to have completely the opposite effect on the potassium. So potassium is going to be held onto because it's less likely to be released, and therefore we're going to get serum levels of potassium going up. Now, one of the hallmark signs of an advanced adrenal insufficiency is a disease called Addison's disease. And Addison's disease is marked by extremely low sodium levels, and that leads to a lot of problems for patients with Addison's disease. Now, let's flip it around. Let's talk about adrenal stress. Increasing levels of cortisol, increasing levels of aldosterone. Well, aldosterone wants to hold on to sodium, and therefore increasing levels of sodium are also associated with adrenal stress. And we're going to see low levels of potassium because it's going to be wasted out into the urine. So that's kind of our patterns here. As you'll notice that they kind of go in the opposite direction. One of the really great biomarkers that we check out in the ODX application is the sodium-potassium ratio. I'm not going to talk about it here. I will cover it in some future articles and then do another video about it. But sodium-potassium ratio is a really cool thing to be measuring because it can tell us things about adrenal stress, catabolic indicators, adrenal insufficiency, and also inflammation as well. All right, I want to talk about one final thing, and that's using the serum levels of sodium and potassium along with other electrolytes such as magnesium and calcium to give us a state of electrolytes in your patients. So a relative electrolyte status can be determined by looking at these four: magnesium, calcium, sodium, and potassium, and also phosphorus and chloride. So what are some of the implications of an electrolyte imbalance? Well, it can affect the body's acid-base systems, it can affect hydration, and even the movement of ions across the cell membrane. An electrolyte imbalance can show up as low blood pressure, cold hands or feet, poor circulation, swelling in the ankles, and immune insufficiency. So we can look at the relative deficiencies of these particular biomarkers, and it will give us what we call an electrolyte score. Now, we follow the electrolyte status and get an electrolyte score in the ODX application. Here's a sample here of what that would look like on one of our functional health reports. And so we're looking here at the relative balance between those 6 different electrolytes and different minerals. And so it gives us a quantitative score. And in this situation, you can see obviously that the patient is at 100%. That means that there are quite a few deficiencies and imbalances in those 6 electrolytes. So we would want to go back and look at those 6 individual biomarkers to determine which of the 6 are causing this score to be so high. So that's it for our short video, our short functional 5. This is Dr. Weatherby. Thank you so much for watching. Look for future videos that I'm going to be creating that are going to be kind of summarizing some of the topics that we will be posting and talking about. And I promise I will be doing the sodium potassium ratio in an upcoming series as well. Anyway, Dr. Dickon Weatherby from Optimal DX. If you're interested in what we're doing, please do go to optimaldx.com. We are an analytical and interpretive and reporting company. We take your patients' blood tests, and we create exceptional visualization of the scores, and we run it through an algorithmic analytical methodology to give you a 60-plus page report called the Functional Health Report. So go check it out, optimaldx.com. I'm Dr. Dickon Weatherby. Thanks for watching.